Your generous support makes this ministry possible. Thank you.
Father, thank you that you are the God of providence. Thank you that you are at work in every detail, not only in our lives, but in history. And if we just pause to reflect on that, it causes us to worship, to think that you are such a powerful and awesome God. And it also humbles us to think that in the grand scheme of things, we don't seem very significant, but nevertheless you condescend to guide us and to work for good in our lives. So help us to take courage from this and to trust you and to walk faithfully before you. Pray that you would be with us now in class. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, let's return to our discussion of persecution in the ancient church. Last time we left off with discussion of a couple of reasons why Romans didn't like Christians in general and why people would actually turn them into the authorities at times. The idea of political rebellion, they didn't acknowledge the Roman gods, they didn't acknowledge Caesar as Lord, which increasingly became the test of political loyalty to Rome. Rome would let you carry on with your other gods, but you demonstrated loyalty by acknowledging Caesar as Lord. Christians didn't want to do that. B, haters of the human race, separatism. Christians objected to the paganism, the idolatry, the sexual immorality of the Roman Empire. So they were viewed as separatists, and that wasn't appreciated. Some other things that Shelley mentioned that Christians were accused of actually showed up in the quiz. What? Sexual immorality, cannibalism, atheism. Let's go there next. Why would they be accused of atheism? How does that make sense? Only one God, and it's not a visible God, right? Imageless worship. The gods that the Roman Empire hosted, if you will, were often represented in images. The bust of the emperor was brought, and you offered incense before a statue. Cannibalism. Why cannibalism? Right, misunderstanding of what was going on at the Lord's Supper. Why would they get this impression that there was cannibalism going on among Christians?
Because the meetings were in secret, kind of, and they said, Jesus said, "This is my body, this is my blood."
Right. So the secret meetings, they're not actually witnessing what goes on, and then the misunderstanding that they were literally eating flesh and drinking blood. In fact, one of the most vicious rumors was that Christians killed and ate infants in sacrifice to their God. So infanticide as well, along with cannibalism. You can understand why, and we're going to see in Bettenson today, a Roman historian thinking that Christians committed abominations, and so they were not popular. Yeah.
Were Christians forced to meet in secret, or why was it so secret at that point in time when Christianity was moving forward?
Well, it was, in some cases, we will see that Christian meetings were banned because they were viewed as political rebels. And so they weren't really welcome in many cases to have public meetings. They weren't welcome they didn't want to meet in the pagan temples. So in a sense, they had to go underground. And we'll see more of that in a little bit. That's a good question. Letter E, someone mentioned this as well, sexual immorality. Why was this rumored to be part of Christian practice? Obviously, it was part of pagan practice, although they sort of spiritualized it, temple prostitutes and things like that. But what in particular about Christianity might suggest sexual immorality? Yes, the idea of the love feast. Sometimes communion was called love feast. The idea that they greeted one another with a holy kiss. And this is probably more a commentary on the pagan mind than anything else, that they were conjuring some of these ideas up. There was a suspicion of groups meeting in secret, that there must be some bad stuff going on. And so part of the sexual immorality was thought to be incest. Why would that be? Because Christians called one another what? Brother and sister. Right. Yes. Okay, I hope you brought Bettinson today, because I want to take you to a fascinating document. Turn to page 3. This is a letter from a Roman governor called Pliny the Younger. So this is an actual document from a Roman governor writing around 112. He was governor of Bithynia. And we'll see in this account how Christianity was actually having an impact on society, much like when we read about it in the book of Acts, how the silversmiths in Ephesus were upset. Christianity was impacting their business. It seems that, although this isn't explicit in this document, it seems that that's part of what's behind this document, as we'll see. But anyway, Pliny was writing to the emperor Trajan, and his concern was, what should I do with these Christians? What is the proper policy? What is the approach that we should take in dealing with Christians? And that illustrates the fact that there was no standard policy at the time. It was more, again, of a local issue. So here's a governor saying, what should I do? It's a little bit long, but it's really fascinating. It also gives us a little bit of insight, not only into the mind of the Romans and their perspective on the Christians, but also a little bit of insight into the early Christians and how they met. All right, here's Pliny. He says, "It is my rule, sire, to refer to you in matters where I am uncertain. For who can better direct my hesitation or instruct my ignorance?" It's a little bit of kissing up to the emperor there. "I was never present at any trial of Christians. Therefore, I do not know what are the customary penalties or investigations and what limits are observed. I've hesitated a great deal on the question whether there should be any distinction of ages, whether the weak should have the same treatment as the more robust, whether those who recant should be pardoned, or whether a man who has ever been a Christian should gain nothing by ceasing to be such, whether the name itself, even if innocent of crime, should be punished, or only if the crimes attaching to that name." Now, what were the crimes attaching to that name? The ones we just listed: sexual immorality, atheism, etc. "Meanwhile, this is the course that I have adopted in the case of those brought before me as Christians. I ask them if they are Christians. If they admit it, I repeat the question a second and a third time, threatening capital punishment So that was at stake, at least in Bithynia at this time. Threatening capital punishment. If they persist, I sentence them to death. For I do not doubt that whatever kind of crime it may be to which they have confessed, their pertinacity and inflexible obstinacy should certainly be punished. That's a remarkable statement. I don't know if they have committed any crime, but the fact that they won't recant when I ask them to, they should be punished for something. There were others who displayed a like madness and whom I reserved to be sent to Rome since they were Roman citizens. You recall how Paul got special treatment because when he played his Roman citizen card. Thereupon, the usual result followed. The very fact of my dealing with the question led to a wider spread of the charge, and a great variety of cases were brought before me. Interesting, right? Pliny starts killing Christians and more are turned in. That could be a number of things. Perhaps the most basic suggestion might be the pagans enjoyed the show of Christians being thrown to the lions or however they were executed. An anonymous pamphlet was issued containing many names. All who denied that they were or had been Christians I considered should be discharged, because they called upon the gods at my dictation and did reverence with incense and wine to your image, which I had ordered to be brought forward for this purpose, together with the statutes of the deities, and especially because they cursed Christ, a thing which it is said genuine Christians cannot be induced to do. Interesting, it does show that some Christians did cave under the pressure, and they honored the gods. And that became a problem. We'll come back to this one. What do you do after the persecution's over and it's safe to be a Christian? What do you do with those who compromised and now want back in? That was a big issue that needed to be dealt with. Okay, 6. Others named by the informer first said that they were Christians and then denied it, declaring that they had been but were no longer. Some having recanted 3 years or more before, and 1 or 2 as long as 20 years. They all worshipped your image and the statutes of the gods and cursed Christ. But they declared that the sum of their guilt or error had amounted only to this, that on an appointed day they had been accustomed to meet before daybreak and to recite a hymn, antiphonally, to Christ as to a God, and to bind themselves by an oath, not for the commission of any crime, but to abstain from theft, robbery, adultery, and breach of faith, and not to deny a deposit when it was claimed. This was contrary to the general impression of what went on in the Christians' meetings. After the conclusion of this ceremony, it was their custom to depart and meet again to take food, but it was ordinary and harmless food, and they had ceased this practice after my edict, in which, in accordance with your orders, I had forbidden secret societies. So, Aaron, that comes back to your question a little bit. It was forbidden for them to meet, and even the secret societies. Pliny assumes that everyone stopped, but I'm sure many Christians continued to meet in secret. I thought it the more necessary, therefore, to find out what truth there was in this by applying torture to 2 maidservants who were called deaconesses. But I found nothing but a depraved and extravagant superstition, and therefore postponed my examination and had recourse to you for consultation. The matter seemed to me to justify my consulting you, especially on account of the number of those imperiled, for many persons of all ages and classes and of both sexes are being put in peril by accusation, and this will go on. The contagion of this superstition has spread not only in the cities, but in the villages and rural districts as well. Yet it seems capable of being checked and set right. So you can see Christianity had a major impact in this area. Many people had become Christians. Now, notice what he says next. There is no shadow of doubt that the temples, which have been almost deserted, are now, why would that happen? Again, think of the situation back in Ephesus. Are beginning to be frequented once more, that the sacred rites which have been long neglected are being renewed, and that sacrificial victims are for sale everywhere, whereas till recently a buyer was rarely to be found. From this it is easy to imagine that what a host of men could be set right if they were given a chance of recantation. Now, put 2 and 2 together in this, and you hear what he's saying at the end. No one was buying sacrificial victims, that is, animals. The temples were being neglected. And you get these anonymous pamphlets turning in Christians. Where do you think those anonymous pamphlets were coming from? Probably the merchants whose businesses were being impacted by the impact of Christianity in their area. And so that is why that helps us understand why Romans wanted to turn Christians in, at least in this case, and probably others as well. Now, next page, very brief paragraph, we have Trajan the emperor's response. Here's his answer to Pliny. You have taken the right line, my dear Pliny. It sounds like he's from England or something. In explaining the cases of those denounced to you as Christians, for no hard and fast rule can be laid down of universal application. So, there you see it. No universal policy, at least at this point. They are not to be sought out. Very important. If they are informed against and the charge is proved, they are to be punished with this reservation, that if anyone denies that he is a Christian and actually proves it, that is, by worshiping our gods, he shall be pardoned as a result of his recantation. However suspect he may have been with respect to the past, pamphlets published anonymously should carry no weight in any charge whatsoever. They constitute a very bad precedent and are also out of keeping with this age. In other words, it's not a good idea. By this time, there's a sense in which we don't want to just kill people for sport or that kind of thing, and probably that's what was behind some of these pamphlets. Okay. Now, you can see from these two documents that what was at stake for being a Christian. In many cases, you could be called to the carpet and said, and be told, listen, curse Christ, worship the images, or, at least for Pliny, capital punishment was the result. Wow, that's serious, right? Makes us appreciate our freedom to be able to practice being Christians without this kind of persecution. But many, many Christians throughout church history have faced this kind of pressure. Christianity continued. Famous statement made by Tertullian, the blood of the Christians, or the blood of the martyrs, is what? Remember the statement? Is the seed of the church. Blood of the martyrs, actually, I think Tertullian's actual statement was, the blood of the Christians is seed. It comes down to us as the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. There was also a general decline in the Roman Empire as time goes on. And what became a common sort of scapegoat was the Christians, and to say all the problems in the Roman Empire, the heavy taxation, the natural calamities that were happening, the invasion of the barbarians, is the result of the Roman Empire allowing Christians to continue, because these Christians are doing abominations, things that make the gods angry, like cannibalism and incest and things like that. Now, when Decius comes to power in the middle of the 3rd century, he wants to restore the ancient glory of Rome. And so he is the one to initiate the first empire-wide persecution. So in other words, persecution then becomes a policy of Rome against the Christians. So what I want to do quickly now is walk through several key emperors and highlight different periods of persecution for the Christians. And obviously we have to start with Nero, right? So notable persecution under Roman empires. Number 1, Nero. We know about Nero from the New Testament. What can you tell me about Nero? What? He was crazy. He was a savage, and this isn't altogether unusual for some of these emperors. Power corrupts, right? Apparently he had his mother stabbed, even though she was the one who helped bring him to power. You know he's not a nice guy if he has his mother stabbed. Come on. He had his wife beheaded for an accusation of adultery. He kicked his mistress to death when she was pregnant. So you get an idea of the character of this guy, or lack thereof. What's he famous for? Burning Rome, right. In July 64 AD, a great fire engulfed much of Rome. And what was suspected about this fire? Why would Nero start the fire? He was insane, right? He was a... What?
I don't know. I thought I might have heard somewhere that he wanted to build a new place in his resettlement.
Yeah, there is the suggestion, and it was widely believed that he was behind the fire in order that he could rebuild Rome more glorious in his honor and have a number of features representing the great Nero as part of the rebuilding project of Rome. And so what did he do to try and get out of that accusation? He blamed the Christians. Peter and Paul are both said to be executed under Nero. I want you to turn back to Bettinson, page 1 and 2. We get a brief description here of the Neronian persecution by Tacitus. Tacitus was a Roman historian, and this is his perspective on things. Very interesting primary document here describing the situation. Now, again, he's talking about the fire here, and he says, "But all the endeavors of men, all the emperor's largesse, and the propitiations of the gods did not suffice to allay the scandal or banish the belief that the fire had been ordered," that is, by Nero. And so, to get rid of this rumor, Nero set up as the culprits and punished with the utmost refinement of cruelty a class hated for their abominations, who are commonly called Christians. Why are they hated for their abominations, or what are their abominations? Well, the things we've been talking about again. See, this is Tacitus assuming these accusations about the Christians in terms of incest and cannibalism and all those other things are actually true. So Tacitus has no time at all for the Christians. All right? He says, Christus, from whom their name is derived, was executed at the hands of the procurator Pontius Pilate in the region of Tiberias. So here we have an extra biblical source confirming the biblical account of Christ's execution. Checked for the moment, this pernicious superstition again broke out, not only in Judea, the source of the evil, but even in Rome, that receptacle for everything that is sordid and degraded from every quarter of the globe, which finds a following. So you can see Tacitus' view of the city of Rome. Accordingly, arrest was first made of those who confessed to being Christians. Then on their evidence, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much on charge of arson as because of hatred of the human race. That's the separatism we talked about. Besides being put to death, they were made to serve as objects of amusement. They were clad in the hides of beasts and torn to death by dogs. Others were crucified, others set on fire to serve to illuminate the night when daylight faded. Nero had thrown open his grounds for the display and was putting on a show in the circus, where he mingled with the people in the dress of a charioteer or drove about in his chariot. All this gave rise to a feeling of pity, even toward men whose guilt merited the most exemplary punishment. For it was felt that they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to gratify the cruelty of an individual. So again, Tacitus has no time for Christians, but he's acknowledging that, hey, the Romans started to feel bad for the Christians because of the brutality of Nero. And this kind of persecution was happening even in New Testament times. Okay, let's move to another emperor who does show up at the time of the New Testament as well, and that is Domitian. Domitian, 81 through 96. Those dates are his time of rule. By all accounts, Domitian was a good administrator, but he had a very dark side as well. Here is one account. Quote, "At the beginning of his reign, Domitian would spend hours alone every day doing nothing but catching flies and stabbing them with a needle-sharp pen." Now, if you're emperor, you'd think you'd have a few more pressing matters to do than to stab flies. Apparently, he liked to watch gladiatorial fights between women and dwarves as well. So, a lot of these emperors were very odd ducks. It was during the persecution under Domitian that the Apostle John was exiled. Where was John exiled? Patmos. Remember from the book of Revelation. Now, what's interesting about Domitian is that he is the first emperor to officially refer to himself as Lord and God, to take on that title himself and actually insist that people honor him with acclamations like Lord of the Earth or Invincible, things like this. So increasingly you can see how the Caesars is not just past Caesars are deified, but now present Caesars are viewing themselves as deity. Okay, and that's definitely seen with Domitian. Now, obviously, Christians would balk at acknowledging the emperor with these kinds of titles, and that led to persecution, including a Roman consul, Domitian's cousin, and Domitian's niece, who were thought to be Christians. So persecution did take place at that time, and again, John himself was exiled. Now, between the years of about 125 through about 160, you have a period of relative peace for Christians. We don't read of major persecutions during this time. This was a time of prosperity in the Greco-Roman world. And so there are these pockets of reprieve. That changes, however, with another emperor you've probably heard of, Marcus Aurelius. And the famous account of Polycarp's martyrdom. Have you heard of that before? Maybe Shelley mentioned it in the reading. Polycarp was one of the apostolic fathers we'll talk about later. His martyrdom takes place during this time. Also, Justin Martyr, who is probably the most famous apologist. Again, we'll talk more about him. He was martyred during this time. By the way, the term martyr comes from Greek term martyria, which means what, you Greek scholars? Witness. So a martyr is one who witnesses with blood. Under Marcus, it became easier for enemies to denounce Christians. You remember Trajan was saying, listen, we don't want these anonymous pamphlets. Well, that wasn't Marcus's policy, and Christian property was seized. In 170, just to give you one account here, 177 in Lyon, that is Gaul or modern France, 48 Christians were killed in an amphitheater. And so, yeah, there's a pocket of persecution under Marcus Aurelius. Now, when you move into the 3rd century, there were, again, local persecutions. If you traveled to Carthage or if you traveled to Alexandria or Rome or Corinth or places like that, you would find persecution of Christians. But again, in general, there is another reprieve. This one approximately, that means about, approximately 211 through 250. But that's going to change now, and change quickly, when Decius becomes emperor in 259. He's the next in the cast of characters here, Decius. And you can see he's not emperor very long, 249 to 251. But there is a significant change that takes place. Decius was concerned that traditional polytheism was dissipating, was on the decline. And that was a bad thing in his view. He wanted to strengthen the worship of the Roman gods, including the Roman rulers of the past, and that would restore glory to Rome. Okay? Again, starting to have problems with barbarians and other problems in the empire. The emperor is sitting there thinking, okay, what can we do? Well, you think back to the ancient glory of Rome, and we acknowledge those great leaders. We acknowledge the Roman gods. And this leads to the first empire-wide persecution of Christians. Now, here's how it unfolded. In 250, Decius issues an edict that requires an annual sacrifice at the Roman altars to the gods and to the emperor. Okay, now, up until this time, it was not required. You didn't have to make an annual trip to demonstrate your allegiance to Rome by offering a sacrifice to the gods. That was not required. If you were turned in as a Christian, that would be the test, right? say Caesar is Lord, curse Christ. We read about that. But now what's different here is Decius is making this empire-wide policy that you have to do this annually. Okay? And if you offered the pinch of incense and said Caesar is Lord and whatever else, you were given what was called a certificate of sacrifice, or libellus was the term. And if you had that certificate, no problem, you were in good standing. Again, put yourself in the sandals of those people, those Christians. What would you do? Many Christians succumbed to the pressure. There was this generation of peace that preceded Decius, and so there's a sense in which they were unprepared to face that kind of situation. Some fled to avoid making this annual devotion to Rome. Some paid bribes to get a libellus without actually acknowledging Caesar as Lord. But many, many Christians refused and did not get a certificate of sacrifice, and therefore were persecuted, and many were executed. For example, the church father Origen, we'll come back to him later, he was tortured under Decius. I want to close, we have just a couple minutes left. I want to close today, unfortunately, on a very depressing, sad note. But maybe in some way the Lord will use it to encourage you to be bold for Christ. I want to give you 4 accounts of those who were persecuted at this time. And this comes from Fox's Book of Martyrs. Number 1, you don't have to write these down, but just to hear the stories of some of the things that Christians went through at this time. Julian, a native of Cilicia, was seized upon for being a Christian. He was put into a leather bag together with a number of serpents and scorpions, and in that condition thrown into the sea. That's a rough way to die, isn't it? Can you imagine? Thrown into a bag with serpents and scorpions? Would you recant if you knew that was going to be your fate? Now, it's a little unfair to ask you that question, because God doesn't give us the grace to face that situation when we're not in it. When we're in that situation, grace will come if we ask for it. So you can imagine the difficulty that was. Another story, a young man by the name of Peter was beheaded for refusing to sacrifice to Venus. And he said very boldly, "I am astonished you should sacrifice to an infamous woman whose debaucheries even your own historians record, and whose life consisted of such actions as your laws would punish. No, I shall offer the true God the acceptable sacrifice of praise and prayers." He has a good point here. The Roman gods are not always very virtuous. And he's saying, why should I sacrifice to those gods? Optimus, the proconsul of Asia, on hearing this, ordered the prisoner to be stretched upon a wheel by which all his bones were broken, and then he was sent to be beheaded. Third story. Nicomachus was brought before the proconsul as a Christian. He was ordered to sacrifice to pagan idols, and he said this, "I cannot pay that respect to devils which is only due to the Almighty." And this speech so enraged the proconsul that Nicomachus was put to the rack, and after enduring the torments for a time, he recanted. But scarcely had he given this proof of his frailty than he fell into the greatest agonies, dropped down on the ground and expired immediately. Number 4, Trypho and Respictus, 2 eminent men, were seized as Christians and imprisoned at Nice. Their feet were pierced with nails. They were dragged through the streets, scourged, torn with iron hooks, scorched with light torches, and at length beheaded February 1st, 251. So again, what a thing to have to stand for your faith when this kind of treatment was threatened. And it's a reminder for us to pray for Christians in parts of the world now facing this kind of threat. Christians are still tortured for their faith. And to remember those brothers and sisters in Christ.